Hello, everybody. It's Martin Kiernan here, and I have the great pleasure to moderate today's Weber teleclass. Our guest is no stranger to teleclass education. It's Professor Hugo Sachs, who used to lead the infection prevention team at the University Hospital in Zurich, but after retirement moved to Bern University Hospital as a senior researcher. And also he has a number of jobs in infection prevention. You can't keep a good man down, as they say. He works in infection prevention, public health and research through his company, Sachs Health Design Incorporated. Now, he's going to be talking to us today about a poster, really, the developments from a poster that I saw at ICPIC last year, but I'll let Hugo explain exactly what that is as he shares his crystal ball initiative with us. So welcome, Hugo.
Thank you, Martin, for the kind introduction. It's great that you're here and doing this with me, and also thanks to Paul, who keeps up doing the Weber class. So this is about the future and how we imagine it in infection prevention, and it is also about this crystal ball initiative that we started in 2019. So next slide. It is difficult to make prediction, especially about the future. And actually time is a slippery ground. And we have not a very clear imagination of what time is. We can't touch it, and still it is called the fourth dimension, aside of the three spatial dimensions. We're especially interested in time because it's what's coming our way, and we try to influence it. So we like to know what's going to happen. And I'm going to talk today first about the motivation to talk about and looking into the future, then introduce you to the Crystal Ball Initiative, and spend a good part of the talk on future studies. Then go back to the first survey that we did in the framework of the Crystal Ball Initiative, and give some ideas what that could be as a development in the future. So why do we care about the future? When we go to next slide, number 5, you can see that this picture shows well how amazing human beings are. We are biological systems, self-producing, self-healing, but above all, gifted with a consciousness. And with this consciousness together as a society, and you see the town down below here, we influence the development or the evolution of our planet in a global scale. And that is why we also have the responsibility to care about the future. So what we do today will have an effect tomorrow. Next slide, number 6, shows the reality of time on a very big time scale. We see here in this graph in the middle, the Earth, the birth of our planet 4,000 million years ago. And this graph shows the time radially. So on the outmost elliptical shape are all the living beings and how they developed over time. And you can see it went from quite early after the birth of the Earth. Life popped up with single cell organisms, bacteria, and then went over plants, fungi, echinoderms to fish, and then amoebians going up to the land, reptiles, and then in the air, birds, and then mammals. And on the next slide, number 7, you can see at the outmost edge on the right, this little branch where we human beings came up. And so we have, with this picture, a good idea of the time scale that came about until now. So there are great topics that lie in our future, and we already talk about those today, like global warming, like the availability of water, like infectious diseases. We just are in the pandemic of SARS-CoV virus, but then also social and political issues. And that is why it's also true on a smaller scale, like the talk today, IPC and healthcare. That is the motivation, actually, to look into the future. And this was the motivation to create this infection prevention and control crystal ball initiative on the next slide. And we asked the question on slide number 9, what is our vision for infection prevention and control? What does the future look like? And we didn't just want to have a vague idea about it and then return to our everyday problems. Next slide, we don't want what futurists call create a used future, something that's just based on the situation now and develop a bit from there. But we wanted to dive deeper. And so we started in 2019 with the first round of an international crystal ball exercise, actually a survey in 2019. And next slide, to which, on number 12, to which 18 invited people responded. And I would like to take this slide also to thank all the people involved who are listed here, who either helps to set up this survey or responded to it. And I would like to especially thank Jonas Marshall, who is here also mentioned. He is central to this crystal ball initiative and helps to analyze the data that we are still analyzing. He was the former head of the infection prevention and control service at the Bern University Hospital and is now director of infectious diseases epidemiology research at the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. Next slide. Future studies. I would now like to introduce a sneak peek into what the field of future studies or future research look like. This kind of knowledge base goes under the name of futures research, future studies, or just futures. And note the fact that future is here named in plural. And we will see later on why it is. It is quite debated if this is actually a science or if it's more of an art. I think it's, first of all, a practice, a technique, and has practical value in the quest to understand and maybe influence, at least partially, the complex reality of time and what it brings our way. And we will see in the next slide the evolution of this knowledge base from the earlier days when looking into the future was only trying to predict the future as it will be, one future quite near, and it served to strategic planning to control this near future. Whereas in the 20 or 30 years that this knowledge field evolved, now there is an insight that the future is also influenced by how we anticipate it, how we see it. And the field has moved from the idea that there is only one future to imagine to several alternative futures that can also be contradictory. There is an association of professional futurists that was founded in 2002. So the evolution went from a more conservative view that served the purpose of short or mid-term planning to a more disruptive open field where several futures were possible. And next slide. Sohail Inyatullah, to quote here, someone who is quite central to this field, says future studies create alternative futures by making basic assumptions problematic. Through questioning the future, emerging issues, analysis, and scenarios, so different techniques, the intention is to move out of the present and create the possibility for new futures. This is not only about, as I said, the presence and some years ahead. It goes further here, like the horizon number 3, 20 to 30 years into the future. Now, as every field likes to structure a bit the way this is approached, also the futurists have created a way to see this. But before that, I would like to again juxtapose the policy making and future studies. Policy making more conservative, purposeful to just make investments or look in the near future, and future studies more disruptive. And we in infection prevention actually do a lot of policy making. And so I think there is value in the ways to include the possibility that there is something happening discontinuous and forecasting trends before they actually emerge. And with the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, we know exactly what that means. So as I said, to this structure, the Association of Futurists adopted these 6 pillars. That's actually a kind of step-by-step approach to creating these different futures. And each of these steps has some common techniques that are commonly used to investigate these fields. So to make this come alive, I would like to run through these 6 pillars and say something about the techniques in use. So next slide, number 19, mapping the future. On slide 20, we see a map that Henricus Martellus created of the world in Florence, Italy in the 15th century. It's quite a detailed map, and apparently it has influenced Christopher Columbus to do his voyage. And I'm showing this map because it hit me once on a hike that actually maps are great future prediction devices, because they will tell you when you walk or run or drive or fly in a certain direction what will happen, what it will look like when you arrive there. So they kind of predict the future. And that's why it's called mapping. So the futurists use in workshops this futures triangle that pulls energy from 3 moments in time. So there is, if we start on the right bottom, the weight of the history, and questions are asked: what is holding us back or getting us close, are getting in our way? What are the barriers to change? What are the deep structures that resist change? And if we translate this to IPC, we could, for example, in a workshop ask or say IPC came from cleaning and disinfection, and there is a kind of moral connotation to it. When we go to the left, there is a push of the present. So there are questions like what drivers of change are pushing us towards particular future, or what quantitative drivers of change are changing the futures. And I have imagined IPC, we could say here as push of the present. We don't fully harvest actually the professional possibilities of data science enough. And then we go to the top. There is a pull of the future, and there are questions like what are the compelling images of the future, those who we can't overlook, or are there competing images of the future? And I imagined for IPC in such a moment, medicine is moving away from acute care to home care or long-term care. And the questions would be, what does that mean for IPC? So this is the technique of futures triennial. And moving to the next slide, 22, timing of the future. Anticipating the future. We can see on slide 23 that here the technique is called emerging issues analysis, a very important technique. And as you can see on the graph from unknown on the left to known right, there is an evolution where first there are very weak signals, then there are trends, and then we go into problems. And the idea would be to take these weak signals very serious and develop from there different scenarios how these weak signals could then evolve into trends and problems. And an example out of infection prevention would be that I've heard in between the two SARS pandemics that SARS viruses very often go from the animal world to the human world. And that would have been such a weak signal that we could have already started to anticipate a pandemic in that moment. Next slide. 24. This is about timing of the future. And sorry, I have to go back. 24, timing of the future. And here we can see different ways to imagine the evolution of time. And that is important to be clear about this. So the more traditional way to imagine would be the future is linear, goes in phases on a linear time scale. But then there are other imaginations like the future is cyclic. So it always comes back to the same moment in time, same situation over and over again, like we imagine the seasons. Or the future is spiral. It comes over and over again, but each time it's a bit different. So there is an evolution in these rotations. And then a possibility is also that time and the evolution in time happens disruptively. So there are moments of disruption. A bit similar, there in the last line, there are hinge periods where change happens and afterwards it goes then again its way. So next slide, 26, deepening the future is another of these 6 pillars. And actually in this, we have a technique called causal layered analysis, a very interesting technique. This is on slide 27. So I've depicted it here with the image of a tree. So on the first of these layers, we have litany, so the story of what is happening now. And I put on the right side always a random example out of infection prevention and control. And so we could say there is this problem of IPC not being well integrated in a healthcare system. And then we go one level deeper and look at the systemic cause of this. This is something that is established over years. And I put here for IPC that for the IPC example, that medicine is organ oriented, so that each department in a healthcare organization has one organ or one disease. And so infection prevention is actually not part of this. And then it goes a level deeper, and here comes some value of this causal layered analysis, because the first two layers we know probably quite well, but then it goes in this level of worldview, and here already there are decennials involved. And I put as an example here that medicine is actually there to fix broken humans that are shipped in to be fixed, and then they go home again in the idea of acute care medicine. And yet there is another layer that develops over centuries that is close to C.G. Jung's idea of archetypes, a kind of DNA that's shared of whole society or cultures. And I put here in in this example that causality is linear, and that we adopted the mechanical worldview or of Newton that is falls often short of understanding complexity of the world. So this is the causal layered analysis, and we imagine that a group of people in a workshop then imagines on each layer the cause of one of the problems. Next slide. The fifth pillar, creating alternatives. This is a bit like creating prototypes for the future. And in the next slide, 29, we see here one technique that is commonly used for this is scenario planning. On the left side, we see the possibility to map or to position a certain scenario in the future in a crosshair of two variables that can be chosen according to what makes sense. Here there is this scale between centralized and decentralized solution, and hostile politics and no political interference. And I let you imagine where then a problem could be situated in such a mapping for IPC. On the right side, there is the important notion that if you create different alternative futures, then they might have different connotations. So there are preferred futures, that's what we usually like to see, or negative futures that we fear. And you will see preferred futures came up in our study the most often. Then regarding stakeholders, there might be disowned futures, or on the contrary, integrated futures. And also very important, the outlier futures that are completely crazy ideas about what will develop. Very important, because we see these disruptive events like the pandemic, like now the war in Ukraine, something that doesn't evolve naturally unless one is sensitive to these early signals. Next slide is the sixth and last pillar, transforming the future. Now slide number 30. Now we jump to slide number 31, asking questions to make this really palpable. What happens when you wake up? What does your home look like? Who do you live with? Do you go to work? And if yes, what does the work look like? What do you eat? What can you see, smell, hear, touch, and taste? And you can see that this is like in a design workshop, that you put people into the reality that will be there in the future with these questions. And on the next slide, 32, even more extreme, that you position you, instead of normally you're in the present, we are now, today, and we're looking into the future and call this forecasting. But then there is the technique of backcasting. So now you project yourself, kind of time travel into the future, live in the future in your head, supported by, for example, the questions that I showed before, and you look back to the present, which is then called in backcasting, and see how it came about that this future then happened. More extreme even, on the next slide, 33, an article in The Economist in 2015 put or introduced a practice of making the future even more realistic by simulations, physical simulations. And they said we can design situations that help us better understand possible futures by visiting them. So they created physical environments that actually showed the future, and you could even walk in there and look around. And we all know that this stimulates solutions, stimulates ideas if you can really touch stuff. And let me jump with slide number 34 now, back in time, 2019, and introduce to you the first crystal ball survey. With the slide 35, the scopes. So we wanted to harvest the vision of senior infection prevention experts around the globe and extract possible and desired futures. We also thought we change a bit the game and invite participants as authors. So everyone who joined and gave an answer to this survey automatically, because it was an open survey and there was a lot of text involved, was also becoming a co-author, also having the possibility to contribute to the evolution of the method. And with that, we wanted to establish a platform that actually has a longer life than just a survey. Next slide, 36. Here is the method. So it was an online self-administered survey of open-ended questions. The participants were purposefully chosen according to the idea that they have an innovative style, according to sources in the web, conferences, and science publications. And we certainly forgot many people that would have contributed to that. And because of that, I will invite you in the end of the talk to participate. We imagine a kind of snowballing that with time, more and more people were coming in by hearing from colleagues about this. So the survey had 4 main questions, and the analysis that we did now was a 2-step inductive qualitative analysis. First, per case, which means per questions, one of these 4 questions, we created codes. Actually, almost all the statements had an own quote, because we tried to use keywords out of the language that these the respondents actually used, and then bundled them in themes and inductively, and then did finally a cross case or cross question analysis to extract leitmotif, what we call leitmotif, so super themes out of that went across all the 4 questions. So here are these questions. First one is, what will infection prevention and control look like in 2030? The second one was, in whose hands will IPC in healthcare lay in 2030? Who will be responsible? So this was the question about the ownership of the topic. And the question number 3 was, what skills and knowledge will be necessary to execute IPC in healthcare settings successfully in 2030? Knowledge and skills. And the question number 4, what are the most burning research questions regarding IPC in healthcare settings that should and will be answered by 2030? So this is a bit of a backcasting idea. What would have happened until the future that made it possible? And so the participants were 18, so 41% of the 44 that were invited, mainly physicians, as you can see, nurses and one healthcare manager. And you can see here on that slide also the distribution in geographical sense. So to the results, question 1. What infection prevention will look like in 2030. Here, a mood analysis. So each quote or each statement was rated if it was had a positive mood, a positive expectation of the future, was neutral or negative. And I can read you a quote from the positive positive example. More time for frontline presence thanks to automatized surveillance. So thanks to the evolution into the future in 2030, people were not so much occupied by collecting and analyzing data because this was automatized, will be automatized, and so they have more time to spend time on the wards. Then a neutral quote, not so different from the IPC reality in 2019. So this respondent saw that in this 11 years from there would not be happening a lot. And a negative view was mainly concerning multi-drug resistant organisms. MDRO will increase on a worldwide scale. So these are examples of this mood analysis. In the next slide, here a quantitative analysis, and you can see here an analysis in the sense of building themes out of the first question. And you can see that automated data processing and system integration were main topics with subtopics that you cannot read on this slide. So the size of these circles corresponds to the number of quotes or codes that are in these themes. And this representation also wants to depict the closeness of these topics with colors and with proximity on the graph. So this was part of the poster that Martin mentioned initially that we showed in Geneva last year at the ICPIC conference. Next slide, 41. Here you can see the cross-case analysis where we built these leitmotifs in different colors for each of the 4 questions. And jumping to slide 42, I would like to run you through these leitmotifs. So the first was system integration. This was about the system being more integrated. This concerned infection prevention and control being more part of the organization. But as the quote says, I think the infection prevention and control hospital epidemiology field will need to rethink the skill sets needed on the team to optimize success of programs. So this was seeing that there would be another skill set needed within the team. So this is also a system integration of knowledge. Then kind of contrary to that, there was this leitmotif of beyond the hospital. And here that concerned everything that went beyond the acute care hospital, which is what we are concerned of most, what our focus in infection prevention and control is acute care, and said, for example, in one note, IPC does not yet own the lower and middle income space. So there was the idea that infection prevention could move to other countries where there is more need for infection prevention. And the second quote, how are we prepared to deal with public health and national and international emergencies? And we know what happened in the last 2 years after this survey. Then implementation was also the third leitmotif, with a quote, quality patient safety departments may gain importance in hierarchy, but the need for special expertise in epidemiology, surveillance, prevention measures, and implementation science and outbreak investigation will persist. So infection prevention should know how to implement new measures, new policies, and so on. The fourth is automatization and digitalization. And we have seen that before in a quote. Here the quote, familiarity and expertise in data management, statistical analysis of data, epidemiological principles, use of artificial intelligence, methods for recognition and investigation of clusters or outbreaks of healthcare-associated infections, knowledge of antimicrobial resistance patterns and pathogen. So artificial intelligence, maybe digitalized recognition and investigation of clusters, epidemiological principles were mentioned quite often. And the last leitmotif was innovation that englobed all the technical and scientific discoveries that were not linked to information technology. The quote here would be, what is the role of the microbiome and immunologic host factors in risk of healthcare-associated infections, and how can these be manipulated or included in prevention of infections? A very important topic. Microbiome and immunologic host factors, and the idea that science will make progress that will be useful for infection prevention. Next slide 43. Here, a graphical representation of the distribution of these leitmotifs across the four questions, and you can see immediately that there was not an even distribution. And here, for example, this distribution is interesting. For example, automatization and innovation did not appear in the second question on ownership. So apparently the respondents didn't see that this was a field that was owned, that was a question of ownership, which could be discussed. Equally interesting is the fact that skills and research seem not to address so much the topic of system integration, also something that could be discussed. And this brings me to the conclusion of this survey. The survey gave a rich pictures in the next slide, 44. The survey gave a rich picture of the potential future. Most answers corresponded to desired future, so this was this positive mood analysis, except this topic of the multi-drug resistant organisms, and also something I didn't mention before, the takeover by administration and quality improvement of infection prevention. A bit of the surprise actually is this these leitmotifs of system integration and beyond the hospital. So these are important, I think, important messages that we have to look into. Potential benefit of using a more structured experiential futures approach to create multiple futures. So this brings me to looking ahead in what the Crystal Ball initiative could look like in the future in slide 45 and then 46. Potential futures of the Crystal Ball initiative itself. Should we deepen the knowledge, or should we deepen it by semi-structured interviews with some of the participants? And a topic that I'm really interested in is the infection prevention function in healthcare institutions. So not only looking at teams, but at the function of preventing infection, how this will be integrated in the future in healthcare institutions. Then the question, and this would be fun to imagine doing futures workshops with the techniques that have presented before. And then the idea that we're actually requested in the survey to have more collaboration with other think tanks that concern infection prevention or the future in other fields. And with the next slide, 47, I would like to invite you to participate. And you can see here the address of the internet where there is a possibility to manifest your interest and get more information about the Crystal Ball initiatives. And with this and a quote from Albert Einstein, we will have the future we deserve. I would like to end here and give back to Martin.
Thank you so much, Hugo. So much food for thought there. And I was really quite struck by the map, thinking it can predict your future. Mm-hmm. But it's only going to choose, predict that future if you choose that direction to go. And you can actually look on a map and decide to take an easy route or maybe a much more difficult route. But the other thing about that is that only gives you some parameters, doesn't it? And there are certain things outside your control. So you might think, I'm going to walk there and it's going to be very nice. And when you arrive, it's thick fog. So other things outside our control actually affect the future, don't they? And how we get there. So, and you can't predict these things. I wouldn't be able to predict the weather. I'm not sure that the weather forecasters in the UK actually are particularly good at predicting the weather either. And so it's really important to get as many opinions from people outside of infection prevention, isn't it, when we're trying to predict our future? Because people will think of things that we never thought of, so it's actually quite difficult. We know what we know, but we don't necessarily know what other people know, and we don't necessarily know how they would think, which means that they would potentially predict a different future to what we might predict.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you said it very well. It's really about having a broad idea about different futures and really going crazy, and then take it serious and map out possibilities how to deal with this how to deal with these different futures and prepare for it, and so be prepared.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult though, isn't it? Because if I go back to a period in my past, I've been in infection prevention quite a long time, and back in 2000, we had a government group look at financial aspects and whether the government are getting good value for money, called the National Audit Office, and they used to occasionally produce a report on infection prevention, basically each time showing nothing had changed and no improvement being made because infection control teams were very small. And I remember in the 2000 year report, so going back quite some time now, we were asked what percentage of infections we thought were preventable. And we said we were maxing out at about 18-20%. So we were taking a very pessimistic view, but we just didn't think we would get engagement. I mean, I remember at that time I was working on my own in a hospital with a microbiologist who covered a couple of hospitals, and there was no other support for the team. And then within a couple of years, the newspapers had got hold of MRSA because they could spell it. and there were pressure on politicians to do something about it. And the government health minister did something that I would never have expected. He set a target for infection reductions that we all thought he was mad. And I used to say, he's absolutely mad. But because of that, organisations had to start getting engaged. And, and that changed everything. But I could never have predicted that. So that's why it's so important to go outside of the box, isn't it, I think?
Yeah, absolutely. I really relate to you bringing that up, that someone from administration actually came in and set the goal, and I can relate to that because in the University Hospital of Zurich, it's exactly what happened when we presented. When I came to Zurich 2013, we wrote a report. We set up a prevalence study and wrote a report, and I also sent it to the CEO of the hospital. And she just sent me an email back. It had like 3 lines or so saying, Dr. Sachs, thank you very much for this report, but what is our goal? And that kind of changed everything. And actually, I kind of was ashamed that we in infection prevention never thought about setting a goal. There are many publications saying infections can be reduced by 50% usually, and this goes on over time. But we never, and we always set goals for hand hygiene or something, but not actually for what we want. Obviously, you have to be able to measure it, but prevalence studies are great for that. So at the time we were at 9%, and then I slept over it and I calculated what would be statistically significant, and so I came up with the idea of 5%. And over the years, we actually came quite close. With the engagement, a lot of engagement by the top administration in the hospital, and that developed in a whole thing. And in first, it was debated if we should dare to say something like that because we could fail.
Well,
but it was very effective.
I was going to say that. Yeah, I mean, do you think that we don't set a challenging goal because the organisation may fail? And often, certainly around that period, the early 2000s, if there was a problem in infection control, it was the fault of the infection control team. I can remember one of the first inspections in the UK by a regulatory body failed the hospital, and the hospital administration sacked the infection control nurse, which was a ridiculous thing to do. So, do we not set a goal because we think we may fail and then get blamed, or do we not set a goal because actually we advise and support, but we don't do? So we are experts in other people's practice, and they have to change their practice for us to be able to achieve our goal. So it can't be the goal of the team, can it? It has to be an organisational goal. So we might recommend a goal to the management, who will and then the managers would say, this is our hospital's goal, to get people engaged. I wonder if we didn't set goals because people would think, oh, it's just you setting that and it's your job to do it. Do you think that's possible?
Yeah. Absolutely. Actually, in the story in the University Hospital of Zurich, there wasn't much change after I came up with this idea, and I think the CEO just took it as Dr. Sachs said, the infection prevention said 5%. Okay, but then I made a story out of it, also in the media outside of the hospital each time I had some occasion for it. And then in 2016, I made so much noise that in the end, the new administration, new CEO suddenly decided that this is now an institutional goal and put resources in it. There was project management, and actually we fought a lot with each other. It's not the same culture and so on. But then the rates went down. From there on, it went down. So the top engagement is important, and you have to kind of succeed in making it their objective.
And once you have some success, of course, people start to believe, because that was also an issue. in that people believed a certain amount of healthcare associated infection was inevitable. Therefore, that then becomes acceptable when it's not acceptable. And so finding a success where you actually show a reduction gives people belief and a bit more confidence to actually go forward, don't they? One of the questions I know you asked was around who controls infection control, or where should they sit in the future. And I often feel that we're quite nervous about other people controlling us, because we seem to be, well, often feel we are the experts in all things infection prevention. But my personal view is I don't think we're going to get great success until we are far more embedded in the organisation, which is a bit along the lines that we've been talking about. Do you feel that's the case, really? We maybe should be far more embedded into management structures than maybe sticking within our epidemiological teams, or within, in the UK it used to be within the lab or within microbiology. Do you think we should be broadening our horizons like?
Yeah, I think why in a hospital treating patients, is there an infection prevention team? Infection prevention is something that is a kind of way of working. It's how you insert catheters, how you decide to operate, how if you give the antibiotic or not, and this is part of the basic job. So apparently we are there that this doesn't get forgotten, and to deliver the metrics and to teach. But as you said before, this has the downside that kind of the whole topic is shifted our way and then isolated there and has its own life, even as you said. Then if something goes wrong in medicine, these people are then evicted because they are to blame. I think we have to rethink the function of infection prevention and look at the organization and rethink what it means, what jobs could be there, and also step down from our role to be infection prevention and to think how this can be done. And this is quite linked to this question, what skills should be integrated. And when you think what it means to actually do a good job, from data science to metrics to design to social knowledge to psychological knowledge, there is such a range of different fields, and I feel that we are not professional enough. We kind of design a poster, but we don't do a user design process to know which is the best poster, what works really. It's very handmade, very because there can't be all these experts in infection, or they are not there usually.
Yeah, we're very good at presenting data back to people in the way we think it should be presented and what means something to us, but that may not be what either means something to somebody else or actually motivates them. Seeing a number per 1,000 catheter days, how does somebody know if that's good or bad unless you actually give some reasonable comparator data? And sometimes that comparator data isn't there. And is there a way to personalize that data anyway? Because infection is bad news for the patient. Therefore, it's making people think about the human aspects. That will work well with some people, and being compared with other organizations will be working well for other people. So it's having a range of communication strategies, isn't it, that's needed?
Absolutely. For me, this is a design requirement. You have to have a user design. You have to test it. You have to understand what the mental models of people are who are going to receive it. And then this is like an interface that you have to design in a way that the human brain with the senses picks up what comes as information this way. And it's a cycle between collecting the data, analyzing the data, and then feeding them back. And if that feedback loop is kind of breaking down at the interface of feeding the data back to the people, then the whole thing is not giving the benefit that it could have. And there is no behavior without having a feedback of what happens when you do something. You couldn't even you couldn't grab a pencil if there wouldn't be the position of your arm fed back to your brain, and that the pressure you put on the pencil perfectly to recreate this in a robot is really difficult. And so to do hand hygiene well, or to do anything well, you have to get the feedback what you do, and this is a design requirement for me.
Yeah, I mean, I always think people respond far better if they know why they're going to do something. I sometimes use the analogy, if I say to somebody, run to the end of the road as fast as you can, they might get halfway there and think, why on earth am I doing this? I'm getting tired. Whereas if you say, if you run to the end of the road as fast as you can, you'll be able to stop that child walking in front of the bus, they will run to the end of the road as fast as they can because they have some motivation. And I think we're quite good at telling people to do things without necessarily explaining exactly why in a way that would be meaningful to them, really.
Yeah, this is another big topic between policy, just the order, and then the underlying knowledge of why it has to be that way.
Yeah, I quite like the fact that people thought that with artificial intelligence, we would be able to and automated surveillance would be able to detect infections. I could see a manager saying, great, we've got automated surveillance to detect the infections. We don't need as many infection prevention people. So there are threats with how we think the future may go as well, aren't we? We always have to be recognizing that. So we have to say, if we can do that, then we will be able to do this, and this will be the result, rather than do this by computer. It means means less people, because I've seen that sort of process happen many times in healthcare.
Yeah. Absolutely. So the whole idea of prevention gaining something by it not happening is really difficult to sell. So you have to have good arguments. That's true.
Yeah, I'm trying to create the business case to be able to do that. Really, I think that'd be absolutely interesting. Yeah. Now, finally, this survey was done before the pandemic. And I'm just wondering how you think the answers may have changed, or do you think people's feelings might have changed because of the experiences during the pandemic?
This is a very, very interesting question. And kind of we're thinking now how we could reproduce you almost have the inclination to redo the questionnaire again and see what people would say.
Do you mean to give them back their answers? To give them back the answers they gave before and say, has your mind changed? Or
yeah, right. Oh, yeah, right. That would be a kind of Delphi way of giving the answers from everyone back, and then see what is the new views to these 4 questions. That would be everyone involved was quite interested in the results and happy about this idea of looking a bit in the future. It's an interesting thing.
It's fascinating, and I would encourage the more wild thinking, the better, because whatever we think may happen, often even more unexpected things happen, and we have to get better at that.
Absolutely. There is one idea that just came up while we talked. Actually, by having more futures at your disposal, more possibilities what could happen, also crazy outliers, the more it becomes resilient, because you it's a bit like variety in DNA that creates better systems, because you have these errors in reading RNA or DNA, and then you are able to adapt because you have different futures that you have already visited and know a bit what could happen. It's a question of resilience, actually.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, I can't wait to see where it goes, really, and. I'm wondering if, I'm going to say, sitting around at a conference normally with a glass of wine, people start to think really outside the box. But I'm not encouraging people to take alcohol before taking part in questionnaires. Who knows?
But to take the breaks in conferences serious.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for joining me
Okay,
and doing this another teleclass. You can anticipate being summoned back again because Paul never lets people off the hook once he has them, and I
right.
really look forward to seeing the future outputs from this. So thank you so much, Hugo.
Yeah.
It's been a real pleasure as ever. Thank you.